The phone rang just as I stepped out onto my new property, a sprawling plot I had quietly purchased months earlier. The HOA signs that dotted the neighborhood smiled at me like warnings I didn't yet understand. I had barely unpacked boxes from my last move, and already there was tension in the air I couldn't ignore. The first call came from the local HOA president, a woman whose reputation for intimidation stretched well beyond her gated community. Her voice was sharp, practiced, the kind that demanded attention even before words formed. "We noticed some recent changes on your property," she said, tone clipped. "We need to discuss compliance." I paused. Compliance? I hadn't signed anything. I wasn't a member. I had made it explicitly clear when I bought this land that I was outside HOA jurisdiction. Yet here she was, implying authority I had no obligation to acknowledge. I reminded her politely, almost too politely, "I'm not part of your HOA." A long silence followed. Then she smiled. I could hear it in her tone, the smug confidence of someone who believes rules bend to their will. "That doesn't matter," she said. "Everyone here abides by community standards. That includes you." I hung up, shook my head, and walked down the driveway. The fields were quiet, the wind stirring the trees just enough to carry the faint scent of autumn. I had bought this land to escape people like her, to escape small-town politics, to finally feel control over my own property. Now it felt like the first day of a storm I couldn't see coming. 2 hours later, a knock at the gate startled me. I walked over and found a uniformed officer standing on the gravel, clipboard in hand. "Sir, we received a complaint from your HOA," he said, tone formal, detached. "They claim you violated community regulations." I blinked, trying to process the absurdity. "I'm not in the HOA," I replied calmly. The officer looked at me like I had spoken a foreign language. "We have orders to ensure compliance. You need to cooperate while we verify the complaint." My pulse quickened. I had purchased this land legally, paid my property taxes, and followed every local ordinance. Yet here was law enforcement acting as if the HOA's word alone carried weight over federal property rights, municipal codes, and my legal protections as the landowner. I realized then that they didn't know who they were dealing with. A week earlier, I had quietly acquired not just the land I stood on, but several adjacent lots previously managed under the HOA's oversight. They had no idea their new landlord, the person with authority over the properties they policed like subjects, was standing right in front of them. Their overconfidence was palpable, their sense of entitlement unchecked. I could feel the tension in the air, the almost theatrical confidence in the officer's stance, the way he hesitated, expecting me to cave. But I didn't. I knew that once they discovered who I truly was, the entire dynamic would change. Until then, they were just a storm of noise on my doorstep. The sun began to dip behind the distant hills, casting long shadows over the fields. I watched as the officer stepped back, flipping through his notes, probably waiting for instructions from a woman who had no legal authority over me. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I felt a small spark of anticipation. Because once they realized that I wasn't just a resident, that I wasn't just another landowner, they were about to meet their new landlord. And, trust me, they weren't ready for what that meant. The next morning, I received a formal notice slipped under my gate. The HOA claimed I had unauthorized occupancy and that my property improvements violated community standards. Their language was stiff, legal-sounding, and intentionally intimidating, but also completely baseless. I had blueprints, permits, and every document proving compliance with local regulations. Yet somehow, they acted as if the mere existence of the HOA letter carried authority over my legally acquired land. Curious how far they would push this, I called the HOA office. Karen, the president, answered immediately. Her voice was bright, almost cheerful, as if she had anticipated this confrontation all along. "We're just enforcing community integrity," she said, practically humming with satisfaction. "It's for everyone's safety that you comply." I calmly reminded her, again, that I was not a member and that the lots I now owned were legally outside their governance. She laughed. Not a friendly laugh. The kind that drips confidence and mockery. "Membership isn't necessary for compliance," she said. Standards apply to all properties, even yours. I asked her to provide documentation proving any such authority. Minutes passed. Finally, she emailed a single PDF, blurry and signed, and lacking any legal seal. It was a map with my property crudely outlined, claiming it fell within the HOA's jurisdiction. A laugh escaped me. I knew exactly what this was. Intimidation masquerading as law. The next day, a county officer arrived. Then another. Fire safety inspector. Environmental compliance officer. Each approached politely. Each asked questions, and each seemed surprised when I calmly handed over permits, property deeds, and documents confirming legal compliance. None of them had authority to enforce the HOA's rules, but Karen had set them in motion, hoping pressure would work. By midweek, she escalated further. I received a certified letter demanding $5,000 for community enforcement expenses. She claimed that because the HOA had acted, I owed them reimbursement. The irony was palpable. They were trying to monetize their own illegal actions. I knew I had to be strategic. I responded formally, emphasizing my non-membership status, enclosing all proof of property ownership, local zoning compliance, and federal land documentation where applicable. I didn't threaten. I didn't yell. I simply laid out facts that any competent legal mind could verify. Karen, of course, ignored the documents, believing her personal authority trumped legal reality. Then came the summons. HOA versus me. The local court would hear the case in a small municipal courtroom. Karen arrived with 3 attorneys, all polished and confident, prepared to lecture me on compliance and community standards. She smirked when she saw me, whispering something to one of her lawyers and laughing under her breath. When the hearing started, she detailed her claims for 20 minutes. Violations, threats to community safety, and noncompliance. Every word was rehearsed, precise, and designed to intimidate. She wanted the court to view me as a lawbreaker, someone defying the community. Then it was my turn. I stood calmly. No theatrics. No aggression. Just presence. I waited for a pause, then said something that made Karen freeze. Before we proceed, may we clarify whether this court has jurisdiction over federally recognized agricultural lots that I now own? The room went silent. Lawyers glanced at each other. Karen's confident posture faltered for the first time. The judge leaned forward, brow furrowed, asking me to repeat the question. I did, slowly. She tried to object. I explained the ownership details and legal boundaries, calmly and with supporting documentation. For the first time, Karen realized she had miscalculated. Her smile faded. Her attorneys whispered frantically. What had seemed like a routine intimidation tactic had suddenly collided with a reality she didn't understand. This was the turning point. The moment when the overconfidence of an HOA president met the unshakable authority of someone who knew exactly where power truly lay. The courtroom tension was thick. Everyone present could feel it, the shift from presumed dominance to uncertainty. And Karen, for the first time, looked like someone who understood that she might have underestimated her new landlord. The judge adjusted his glasses, leaning back slightly in his chair as he reviewed the documents I had placed neatly on the bench. I had anticipated this moment for weeks, quietly gathering every deed, easement, zoning map, and permit for the land I now owned. Each page told the same story. Karen and the HOA had no authority over my properties. Each stamp, seal, and signature validated my legal position. The courtroom, previously buzzing with her confident declarations, had shifted into a hushed anticipation. Karen's lawyers whispered among themselves, rifling through their overstuffed binders for anything they could use to counter my evidence. Every page they flipped only reinforced my point. The confidence that had carried Karen into the room evaporated as she realized her entire argument rested on the assumption that no one would verify facts. She had overplayed her hand, and the cracks were now visible to everyone in the room. The judge finally looked up from the documents, eyes narrowing in curiosity. "Sir," he asked, "can you clarify your standing and ownership of the lots in question?" I responded calmly, outlining the acquisitions, providing the exact legal descriptions, referencing federal and county-level documents that proved jurisdictional authority and explaining the limits of HOA governance. Karen's mouth opened slightly, as if she were about to interrupt, but her attorney's startled glances silenced her. Then came the moment I had anticipated, but still held a sense of anticipation for. The judge asked almost casually, "Do you hold any formal authority beyond property ownership?" I paused, letting the weight of the room settle before speaking. "Yes," I said quietly. "I am a federal judge, currently on senior status." I did not mention this before because it is irrelevant to the property matter at hand. However, your claims, if pursued further, intersect with federal jurisdiction and property law, which I am fully empowered to enforce. The courtroom went completely still. Karen's face paled, her previous smirk replaced with wide-eyed panic. One of her lawyers literally took a step back, suddenly aware that their strategy had collided with authority far beyond their calculations. The judge adjusted his position in disbelief, clearly processing the implications. Murmurs rippled quietly through the room as the sheer magnitude of the revelation sank in. Karen attempted to speak, but the judge held up his hand, signaling her to remain silent. Every confident line she had rehearsed evaporated in an instant. Her carefully constructed narrative of compliance, community protection, and intimidation had collapsed under the weight of documented evidence and legal authority she could not comprehend. During the recess, Karen whispered urgently to her attorneys, but the body language betrayed her: shaky shoulders, hesitant glances, and a general aura of desperation. They had realized, perhaps too late, that the game they thought they were playing was no longer one they controlled. The balance of power had shifted completely. When the hearing resumed, the judge quickly dismissed the HOA's claims, citing lack of jurisdiction and the clear documentation I had provided. He warned the HOA that any further frivolous filings could result in sanctions and legal penalties. Turning to Karen directly, he said, "Actions taken under presumed authority, without legal standing, may constitute violations, potentially including arson or harassment if escalation continues." Her lips parted slightly, but she remained silent, clearly calculating the next move. Walking out of the courtroom, I felt the tension in the air dissipate, replaced by a quiet satisfaction. The power dynamic had shifted, and Karen's overconfidence was now fully exposed. The HOA would have to confront not only their mistake, but also the legal consequences of their actions. For the first time, the illusion of control they wielded over the community crumbled, leaving them vulnerable and exposed. The property was still mine, the land intact, and the authority now unmistakably clear. Karen and the HOA had underestimated the new landlord, and that underestimation would have consequences far beyond anything they imagined. And in that quiet, momentary calm after the revelation, I knew that the real story, the reversal, the confrontation, and the consequences, was only just beginning. The days following the courtroom revelation were unlike anything Karen had ever experienced. The HOA office, once a hub of her confident commands and unchecked authority, became a place of quiet panic. Emails went unanswered. Phone calls were returned with stammering apologies. The board members she had relied on for validation now avoided her, their faces tight with unease. Karen, for the first time, faced the consequences of misjudging the person she had been trying to intimidate. Federal investigators, alerted by the arson complaint I had filed, arrived at the HOA office unannounced. They requested records, financial statements, and correspondence. Karen tried to hide her panic behind a veneer of professionalism, but it faltered under the scrutiny of officers trained to detect irregularities. Documents revealing her instructions regarding complaints against my property, as well as evidence suggesting overreach and potential liability, were flagged immediately. Her attempts to downplay or redirect attention only heightened suspicion. Meanwhile, the local HOA community buzzed with confusion. Residents who had long followed Karen's strict rules began questioning her authority. Meetings that had once been packed now sat nearly empty. Board members who had once defended her aggressively now quietly resigned or avoided participation. The illusion of control she had wielded was crumbling faster than she could react. Karen herself was summoned to federal proceedings related to the arson investigation. As she entered the building, she was no longer the confident, smug antagonist she had been at the start of this ordeal. Her steps were cautious, her voice subdued. The same people who had once nodded eagerly at her commands now regarded her with measured caution. She realized that authority, in the absence of legal standing, was fleeting. In court, her demeanor faltered completely. The prosecutor outlined her actions clearly. Directives that led to the unauthorized interference with my property, threats of enforcement, and, most critically, her role in the arson of my barn. Each point was supported by documentation, HOA emails, posts on the community bulletin, and statements from board members. Karen could not dispute the evidence. Every line of her argument, once rehearsed to perfection, collapsed under factual scrutiny. I was called to testify. Standing before the court, I spoke calmly, factually, and without emotion. I detailed the timeline, the acquisition of my properties, the HOA's attempts to assert jurisdiction, Karen's threats, and the resulting arson. I emphasized compliance with local and federal regulations, presenting permits and deeds without commentary or hyperbole. The room absorbed each point silently, the tension thick but controlled. Every eye on Karen reflected a dawning realization. Her overconfidence had led her into a trap she had not foreseen. After my testimony, the judge addressed Karen directly, highlighting the gravity of her actions and the overreach of her assumed authority. He made clear that any further attempts to assert power over my land or threaten compliance would result in additional legal penalties. Karen, once so sure of herself, sat motionless, the weight of accountability finally pressing down. Outside the courtroom, the HOA office had begun to dismantle its control structures. Policies were revised, leadership changed, and restitution processes began. Residents quietly acknowledged that the abuse of power they had tolerated for years would no longer dictate their lives. Karen's position as the dominant force in the community had evaporated. Walking through my fields that afternoon, I felt the tension lift. The land was safe, my authority undisputed, and Karen's reign of intimidation definitively broken. The confrontation had not been about loud arguments or public spectacle. It had been about preparation, documentation, and the quiet assertion of legitimate power. And while the story of the arson, the court hearing, and the HOA's unraveling made headlines for days, the most important victory was simple. Authority that is grounded in law cannot be undermined by intimidation or assumption. Karen had learned that the hard way, and the community had learned that justice, though delayed, is inevitable. By the time sentencing and restitution proceedings arrived, the story had spread far beyond the local neighborhood. News outlets highlighted the shocking audacity of Karen and the HOA's actions, framing it as a cautionary tale of overreach, intimidation, and the consequences of misjudging authority. Legal forums and property rights blogs dissected every move, analyzing how a routine HOA dispute had escalated into federal scrutiny. Residents from nearby communities called, curious to know how a landowner could stand firm against systemic intimidation and emerge victorious. Karen accepted a plea deal for the federal charges brought against her: arson, abuse of organizational authority, and intentional interference with property rights. The federal court imposed prison time, restitution for damages, and a permanent ban on her holding any leadership role within HOA boards or community associations. The ruling was definitive. Any further attempts at intimidation or unilateral enforcement would result in additional severe consequences. The HOA itself dissolved within 6 months. Its former members quietly acknowledged the mismanagement and the overreach that had led to federal intervention. Meetings once characterized by tension, fear, and coercion were replaced by community gatherings focused on maintenance, neighborly cooperation, and transparency. Participation dropped, but trust increased. Residents understood that compliance works best when mutual, not enforced by fear. Meanwhile, I rebuilt the barn. The new structure was larger, sturdier, and fully compliant with both local and federal regulations. Contractors consulted the previous permits and designed improvements with the oversight of federal inspectors, ensuring that no loophole or vulnerability remained. The harvest season arrived, and for the first time, I worked without concern over threats, compliance letters, or midnight visits from officers acting under HOA complaints. Neighbors occasionally stop by and ask if I regret not revealing my identity as a federal judge sooner. I tell them the truth. I wanted to demonstrate the limits of intimidation. Authority doesn't lie in threats or assumptions. It exists in knowledge, preparation, and the patience to let evidence speak. Karen had believed that she could bend compliance and fear to her will, but she had underestimated the foundations that true authority rests upon. Financially, the restitution and insurance reimbursements covered damages and legal fees. But more importantly, a precedent had been set. The community learned that overreach carries tangible consequences and that power, when abused, is often short-lived. Karen had assumed that she could control the narrative and impose rules without oversight. That assumption cost her credibility, freedom, and influence. Walking through the fields one evening, watching the sun set over the corn, I felt the calm that comes from justice served, not revenge, not spectacle, just resolution. The barn stood strong, the land was secure, and the neighborhood now respected the boundaries of law rather than the whims of a self-proclaimed authority figure. Karen had thought fear could substitute for legitimacy. The HOA had assumed that compliance could be coerced rather than voluntarily maintained. They had learned, painfully, that authority grounded in law, fairness, and preparation cannot be shaken by intimidation. And I had learned, once again, the quiet satisfaction that comes from standing firm, knowing the truth will eventually surface. The fields were peaceful, the harvest secured, and the lessons were clear. Power can be misused, rules can be bent by those who misunderstand them, and communities can fall under the weight of their leaders' arrogance. But ultimately, authority rooted in law and justice prevails. Karen's overconfidence had destroyed her position, but it had reaffirmed one undeniable truth. A person who respects the law, knows their rights, and acts with clarity can overcome even the most audacious attempts at intimidation. And as the wind rustled through the corn, I smiled, knowing the land and the law were finally safe.